Go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone to today's training. This is part one of a multiple part training series on CoC Program Administration. If you are a current CoC recipient, you are in the right spot. As Jim mentioned a few minutes ago, in case you missed it, this presentation is largely going to focus on content specific to current CoC program recipients. So if that does not apply to you, you are welcome to stay. But I don't know how valuable this training will be for you all. If there are a couple of housekeeping items before we get started, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, we're going to have time at the end for Q&A, but if you have questions throughout, please feel free to drop those questions in the chat as they come to you. Everyone should have mic access, so you can also unmute yourself and share your question over mic, and we will answer it. We will make this training available on our YouTube channel for review later. And with that, I think we are good to go ahead and get started. Again, this will be recorded and shared after today's session. And I am joined today by my colleagues, Jim Ward and Axton Nichols will be introducing themselves here on the next slide. But in case, a quick introduction for myself, I'm Hope Rogers. I'm the CoC Performance Coordinator with Texas Homeless Network and for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. So we're going to be covering a range of topics in today's training, as listed on screen here. Before we get into it, I do want to acknowledge that the training that we're delivering today is slightly different than what we had originally intended. If you registered for this training in the first couple of weeks that it was available, you may have noticed that the description for the webinar changed slightly. So this training was originally primarily going to be delivered by our regional HUD TA provider and cover topics like how to document client eligibility, how to determine rent reasonableness, how to complete a utility allowance, things of that nature. We do still plan to deliver that training, but after meeting with our HUD TA provider, have decided to pause the delivery of that training temporarily until we update our written standards for service delivery, as well as update our client eligibility packets, which we'll be talking about more on a future slide. And it simply didn't make sense to train you on those things and then update them and have to retrain you on them. So today's training will largely focus on everyone's favorite topic, which is monitoring strategies for CoC recipients, as well as HUD's monitoring strategies and our monitoring strategies as a CoC. And like I said, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to ask your questions throughout. I'm having some connection issues today because of the weather, so I'm going to turn my camera off. I am still here. So moving on, again, I already did an introduction. Hope Rogers, CoC Performance Manager, and I will let Jim and Axton introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, Jim Ward, Director of Planning here at THN. I'm going to try to be as quiet as I can during this training, but I'm here if folks have questions. I'll be monitoring the chat and trying to answer questions in the chat as they come through. And really excited to see, again, all the familiar names and names that I don't know. Yeah, that's me. Glad to be here.
All right, hello everyone. I am Axton Nichols. I am the CoC Performance Coordinator here at THN. I was previously working on the Emergency Solutions Grant, so if your agency receives that funding, you may have already been working with me. But yes, now I'm focusing on the CoC program.
And now we want to hear from you. So in the chat, if you could respond to these points, tell us your name, the agency that you work for, the community that you live in or work in, And we want to hear an inspirational movie, book, music, podcast, or other piece of media that you have consumed recently that you found inspirational and why. So we'll give folks a few minutes to respond to that in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. We would love for folks to come off mute throughout this presentation. So we'll give folks a few minutes to respond to those questions.
Oh, Jamie, I've heard of Homeboy Industries. I have not read. Is that a book or a movie or a podcast or something different? Cool, cool. Yeah, I've heard of them for sure. The Daily Stoic podcast. So, you know, selfishly, this is part of the reason we do this is to get new content for ourselves.
Right. Having all these
it's always so cool it's always so cool to see what people are into. Toxic charity. Ooh.
Ooh, I've heard of that one. I haven't read it, but I've heard it's good. Yep, Brene Brown. Was waiting for someone to plug Brene Brown.
Always.
Ooh, the Next Right Thing podcast. I don't think I've heard of that. I don't see any more answers trickling in. If you want to, oh, I see a couple more coming in. If you want to keep responding those into the chat, we welcome you to do that and keep writing down your suggestions. But I will go ahead and move us on to the next slide. Thanks so much for participating, y'all.
So Texas Homeless Network, if you're unfamiliar with who we are and what we do, our mission is to lead Texas communities to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. We do that through a number of kind of organizational activities, including advocacy, both at the state and national level. We also serve as the CoC's collaborative applicant and the HMIS lead agency for the Balance of State Continuum of Care. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is. If you're interested in joining us for any of those activities, there are a number of ways to sign up to kind of stay up to date on what's going on, both like at the state legislature and with the Continuum of Care. We'll find those links and plug those into the chat as well if you're not already connected. But next slide, please. So within Texas Homeless Network is this idea of a continuum of care, and specifically the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. The Balance of State Continuum of Care is a 215 county area in the state of Texas that for the purposes of specific HUD funding are viewed as a single community. A continuum of care is simply a group of stakeholders working together to prevent and end homelessness. Our mission statement for the Balance of State is to develop system level responses and coordinate local community strategies that prevent and end homelessness. So how do we do that? We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. But there are 11 continuums of care. Could you take us to the next slide, Hope? There are 11 continuums of care in the state of Texas. So the Balance of State is on this slide, the orange area on the map. So you can imagine the challenges coordinating strategies to prevent and end homelessness look very different in Cameron County than they do in San Angelo or in Lubbock or even in Texarkana or Galveston. So there of the 11 CoCs, we're the, again, largest by landmass. We do that work primarily through a number of different ways that I'll talk about on the next slide. So the CoC is structured such that all activities are under the guidance and direction of, next slide, please, of the Continuum of Care Board. The Continuum of Care Board is structured or is made up of stakeholders from that 215 county area that specialize in different aspects of the work to end homelessness. So for example, the Continuum of Care Board has seats designated for people working in criminal justice. We have seats designated for people with lived experience of homelessness, people working with people experiencing chronic homelessness, and so on and so forth. There are 16 seats on the Continuum of Care Board. Currently, 15 of those 16 seats are filled. The 16th seat is actually that of a young person with lived experience, so a transition age youth, age 18 to 26. And we have yet to identify that person. So sooner rather than later, there will be a 16th person on that CoC board. But right now, there's 15 actual board members that participate in monthly meetings to guide and support staff in the work to fulfill the responsibilities of a CoC. Those board members sometimes, not always, also participate in our CoC committees. So CoC committees are really kind of how we get systems level work done. And so those CoC committees are things like the data committee. So that's a group of stakeholders from that 215 county area that are looking at things like HMIS, point in time, and system performance measures. HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System, if you're unfamiliar with that term. But we have a variety of committees, and they're listed out on our website. I'm not going to go into them in depth here because it's not the purpose of this space. But just know that those committees are something that we really want local participation in. And if you're interested in learning more about those, you can visit our website. You can send me an email, jim@thn.org. The next item on our governance structure is the Texas Homeless Network. So the Texas Homeless Network is essentially the staff support for this CoC, right? Like it would be really hard to coordinate any type of activity between Texarkana and Brownsville without some kind of dedicated staff support. So Texas Homeless Network provides the dedicated staff support that the CoC needs to fulfill the required functions of a continuum of care. And then close to last, but definitely not least, are our local homeless coalitions. So local homeless coalitions are local groups, local planning groups that work to end and prevent homelessness in their community. So I know we have folks here from the Denton County Local Homeless Coalition. We have folks here from the South Plains Local Homeless Coalition, the San Angelo local. There are about 30 local homeless coalitions in our service area. So in that orange area there on the map. And these are, again, mostly autonomous groups that work to end homelessness in their community. We cannot do the work of the CoC without local homeless coalitions, because y'all are the folks that are doing things like actually conducting the point in time count, actually running housing and service programs. So local homeless coalitions really should be at the top of this list, in my opinion, because they are the backbone of the continuum of care. And then last but not least is the coordinated entry planning entities. Coordinated entry is a method to ensure that folks most in need of services get those services in a more streamlined way than kind of a first come first serve approach to service delivery. Coordinated entry is a requirement of certain federal funding sources. And again, we do not at THN want to be making decisions for local communities about how their coordinated entry system should function. So that really falls to the local coordinated entry planning entity. There are, at my last count, 17 local coordinated entry planning entities that are made up of local stakeholders around the balance of state. I recognize that is a very quick rundown of the governance structure of the balance of state. We could probably do an entire hour and a half on CoC governance and how the CoC functions. But yeah, if there are questions about any of that stuff, please feel free to chat me And then I think that's my last slide. I'll give it back to you.
Yep, thanks, Jim. So we wanted to give you a sneak peek of what's to come in 2023. So as mentioned previously, we are working with our regional HUD TA provider to update our written standards for service delivery in the Texas Balance of State CoC, as well as update our eligibility packets for both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. A quick note that those eligibility packets are being updated for clarity purposes and not necessarily for content. So if you're using those packets now, which I imagine that many of you are, don't panic. You can still use those packets in the meantime until we release those new versions. Additionally, in 2023, we are implementing a renewed focus on quarterly performance scorecards and a new focus on monitoring, which we will be talking about much more in depth later in this presentation. Tons of training opportunities coming up now and throughout the year for CoC recipients, some of which are plugged later in this agenda. I do want to give a shout out to everyone who participated in the training needs survey that I put out a few months ago. We had a surprising amount of folks who indicated they wanted training around internal monitoring strategies. I actually think it was our most requested training topic, which is why we are meeting here today. Additionally, we will be onboarding our new projects for the supplemental and annual NOFO. Annual NOFO awards have still not been announced yet. I do want to acknowledge that the results of the supplemental NOFO were not what we had hoped for, and we recognize that many of the folks on this call might be disappointed in those results. That being said, we are incredibly grateful for the funding that we did receive, especially recognizing how many CoCs throughout the nation didn't receive any funding through either set aside. And lastly, we will be revising our involuntary reallocation policy, and we'll share that with you when it's available. To my knowledge, this policy hasn't been updated since it was created, and our CoC has come a long way in terms of development. So it's due for an update to make sure that aligns with where we're at currently as a CoC. And with that, I will hand it over to Axton for a poll question.
All right, good morning, everybody. Time for a little bit of interactivity here. We have a poll question up on the screen right now. If you want to go ahead and look at that question, which of the following is not an expectation for CoC recipients? And if you could go ahead and type in the letter corresponding to the response that you think is correct. Just go ahead and use the chat for this. All right, doesn't look like we're able to sneak anything by you guys. I told Jim we couldn't start asking for tribute. I told them they would know that they don't have to do that. All right, yeah, so correct answer there is pay tribute for THN. Obviously, that's not required, but these other items on here are actual requirements. So that includes reading and being familiar with the CoC program interim rule. Means you need to receive approval from THN for any significant grant amendments. It's also a requirement that you participate in HMIS or a comparable database. But again, it's not a requirement that you pay tribute to THN, although I guess we probably wouldn't turn it away.
Yeah, I do want to note that this is a requirement of some CoCs, but this is not something that we do in the balance of state.
All right, so moving on to discuss the full kind of expectations of CoC recipients. So during the funding competition, you may remember having seen the CoC program applicant expectation form. So all projects who are applying for CoC funds must agree to the terms of the expectation form during the competition. And then once HUD actually makes awards of those CoC funds, we go back to all the projects and have projects sign an actual copy of the form. THN will collect that form and sign it, and then send a copy back to you. So it's kind of an executed agreement between THN and recipients. So what is included on that expectations form? I believe Hope has dropped the link in the chat if you want to pull that up now or later and look at it. But some of the things included on there, we expect CoC recipients to include THN in all communications to their HUD rep. So just CC us on those emails, just so we can kind of know what's going on and not be surprised by issues that come up later. We also request that CoC recipients notify THN when they are selected for HUD monitoring, and then to also share the outcomes of that monitoring after that has occurred. CoC recipients are expected to staff all involuntary terminations with THN. So that's just for PSH projects. Also expected to seek approval from THN prior to requesting grant extensions or significant grant amendments. So that was kind of touched upon in the previous slide on one of those options, one of those responses. Recipients are expected to participate in CoC program trainings and Texas Balance of State CoC trainings. So congratulations to everybody here. You were fulfilling at least part of that requirement by attending this training. And CoC recipients are also expected to participate in the pit count and hit count, so the point in time and housing inventory count that occurs each year. There are several other expectations not shown on here. Just go through them quickly. That includes, again, participation in the HMIS or comparable database. We also expect recipients to have some consumer involvement on their agency board. So petition someone who had lived experience of homelessness on the agency's board, contributing to the kind of those decisions. CoC recipients are expected to maintain their own policies and procedures, and also expected to develop and execute internal monitoring strategy, which is going to be touched upon later in this presentation. And then also expected to just attend CoC meetings and to participate in committees and work groups, as well as participating in the local homeless coalitions. I would also note that the CoC expectation form document also includes a list of kind of suggested readings for new projects to kind of get up to speed on some of the basic regulations and some suggested trainings as well.
Great, thanks, Axton. So before we move into a really deep dive of all things monitoring related, I wanted to share some administrative resources and tools for recipients. All of these items are linked, and we will share a copy of this presentation with you after today's session so that you can have access to those links. And I would strongly encourage you, regardless of your position and your relationship to the CoC program, to really dedicate some time to spending some time with each of these resources. So the internal wellness checklist should be a document that is familiar to many of you if you have been around for a while. It contains a list of record keeping requirements as well as required policies and procedures you need to have on file to ensure that your project is in compliance with the CoC program. The self-paced admin trainings that are linked here are trainings that are free and published through HUD Exchange. You will need to either log into your HUD Exchange account or create an account, which is free to do for anyone. And again, would strongly encourage you to create an account and access the tools that are available within HUD Exchange, because there are quite a variety of training resources for CoC recipients. The policies and procedures cheat sheet is exactly what it sounds like, and is an excellent resource and somewhat of a companion document to the internal wellness checklist. So it contains a list of recommended policies and procedures, and then within those indicates which ones are required for the CoC program. Anything that isn't required necessarily is definitely a best practice to have and maintain. And just a note that the list is not exhaustive and not every item on there may be relevant to your project type. I see that Axton just dropped all the links in the chat. So as you're reviewing these materials later, and if you have questions about whether or not a policy or procedure would apply to your specific program, feel free to send those questions to Axton and myself. And then the written standards are also linked here. Again, these are will be updated here pretty soon through work with our regional TA provider, but are still a great resource in the meantime if you're not familiar with that document. So moving on, before we get into our monitoring strategy as a CoC, I want to take some time to talk through HUD's risk assessment and their monitoring strategy. So the risk assessment is an assessment completed annually by your HUD representative at your local HUD field office to determine the recipients who will be selected for program monitoring in a given year. Before we get into the specifics, I do want to note that the assessment itself may vary by field office. So the assessment that the Fort Worth offices use may be different from what Houston uses and maybe different from what San Antonio uses. But in general, the tool assesses items in 3 broad categories, which include grant management, financial management, and services and satisfaction. And then within each of these categories, your HUD rep will use some predefined evaluation criteria to determine if there's a low, medium, or high risk present. Being a high risk isn't necessarily a bad thing. For example, some of the things that can be considered a high risk are if your award is over a certain threshold. I believe that's $400,000 is that threshold. If your agency is subject to single financial audit requirements, if you have subrecipients, these are all factors that would make you a higher risk than a recipient that doesn't meet those criteria. One of the factors that makes you a higher risk is the last time that you were monitored by HUD. So if it's been a few years since you've been monitored by HUD, then you're considered a higher risk. And to that end, monitorings from HUD are really not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And that is not meant to scare you, but rather to prepare you. So taking all the info a step further, I want to talk through HUD's monitoring strategies, which again, grantees selected for monitoring in a given year are done so through the risk assessment that we just talked about. I believe we also, I forgot to mention, we linked that risk assessment on the slide previously. So if you want to take a look at what that risk assessment contains, I would encourage you to do that. But the monitoring itself typically occurs on site at your organization over the course of 2 to 4 days. Thank you, Axon, for putting that in the chat. I believe the CoC program starts on page 86 of that notice 2204. So the monitoring itself typically takes course over the 2 to 4 days, though the past couple of years, HUD has been monitoring folks remotely in response to COVID, though I imagine it will only be a matter of time before they return to on-site monitorings. If you are selected for monitoring, you'll receive written notice from your HUD rep around 3 to 4 weeks in advance of the monitoring. And then following the written notice, but prior to the monitoring itself, your HUD rep is likely going to request that support documentation in advance, which can include copies of all policies and procedures that govern the program, client files, draw documentation, match documentation, really any relevant piece of documentation that might be covered in a monitoring. When it comes time to the monitoring itself, your HUD rep will use all of that documentation to evaluate your compliance within the CoC program, and they do that by evaluating your records against what's called the HUD or CPD monitoring exhibits for the CoC program. If you've been around a while, you've probably seen or at least heard of the monitoring exhibits. I know we talk about them a lot with folks. And if you're new to the CoC program, this is definitely an area where you're going to want to spend some time. The monitoring exhibits are forms that your HUD rep will use during a monitoring to determine your compliance to the program. So they break down each area of compliance within a given category. And then based on a review of your documentation that your HUD rep has available to them, they will assess whether or not you demonstrated compliance in that area and how they got to that conclusion. And it's important to note that even if an exhibit is relevant to your project, not every item on that exhibit may be relevant to your specific program type. We'll take a look at the exhibits here together in just a second. And as a result of working through those exhibits, your HUD rep will determine if there are any findings, concerns, or observations through the monitoring that would result in a corrective action plan. So for example, if there is a finding around inadequate documentation of homelessness status for a particular client, the corrective action would likely include your staff having to obtain that homelessness documentation for that participant. Could also include developing a policy around obtaining participant eligibility record keeping requirements or retraining your staff on those requirements, and then submitting that evidence to HUD, typically within 90 days after receiving the finding. And there are scenarios where corrective action plans could result in repayment of funds, which is why it's so important for folks to monitor their compliance internally. We definitely don't want to see y'all have to repay funds if you can avoid it through doing some internal monitoring. So we've been talking a lot about monitoring exhibits. This is a table that lists the exhibits and the relevant project types. I would encourage you to spend some time with this list and the monitoring handbook, which we have linked, and Axon just dropped in the chat a couple minutes ago, but I'm going to pull that website up here. If you'll give me just a second to reconfigure my screen, we can look at that together.
And hey, y'all, don't forget, I know this is like not necessarily the most exciting content, but if you have questions about this, like this is the place to ask them. We want, you know, whether it's about this or about anything that we've covered so far, you know, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat.
Yes, thanks, Jim. So hopefully folks can see the CPD monitoring handbook. Is that what folks are seeing?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this is the kind of landing page for the monitoring handbook. There's a lot of information here. The only thing that is relevant to CoC recipients is chapter 29. So what I do is I just Control F for the CoC program, and it takes you straight to chapter 29. And you can see a list of all of the exhibits that are available for download here. So let's say you're a rapid PSH or joint component project provider, and you want to review your files for homelessness documentation. You can download that document by clicking on the Word icon, and it will take you straight to a download. And while this is loading, there's a lot of content on these exhibits. Again, not every item is relevant to every project type. We take some time to read the instructions, because these are the instructions that your HUD rep will use when they are monitoring your project. So you can see exactly how they're going to monitor this area. For this specific exhibit, they will request a copy of HMIS IDs for current and former participants, select a random sample of those IDs, and then review those files using this exhibit. And each area of compliance is presented in question form. And then it has a space, it cites the relevant regulation that compliance area is tied to. So if you have a question about, what is this asking, a good place to start would be looking for the relevant guidance that it cites. These aren't the easiest to understand. So as you're working through them, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us and we can help break them down into easy to understand language, because they are not the most intuitive documents. And then I do want to note, if you identify, if you work through these exhibits and identify a compliance issue within your program that cannot be resolved, it is always better to ask for forgiveness than try to hide the issue and hope that it goes away. I'm going to bring this up a couple more times throughout this presentation, but I cannot stress enough that it is always better to ask for forgiveness than to try to cover it up. If you do identify a compliance issue, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to us so that we can assist you in approaching your HUD rep and so that we can support you. When you do reach out to HUD, we obviously cannot support you or advocate for your project if we don't know what's going on, and definitely don't want to be blindsided by that information either. So please reach out to us and we can provide guidance on next steps. And with that, I think we're at another poll question.
All right. Go ahead and type your responses in the chat again. This question we're asking, what is the most common type of monitoring finding? This appears to have been a tougher question than the first one.
We're not grading y'all.
And obviously we tried to make this question a little bit difficult, and that all of those are fairly common monitoring findings, but one of them is maybe more common than the others. Much wider range of answers this time. So I see a lot of people responding A, a few people going with option C, and we also got a response for D. Looks like the responses are slowing down, so I guess we want to go ahead and reveal the correct answer. There you go. Insufficient documentation of match is the most common type of monitoring finding. So definitely important to get and maintain that documentation.
Yeah, that might be kind of surprising to folks, but in my experience with the CoC program, HUD considers match. They take match very, very seriously, to the point that again, insufficient documentation of match could, and I have seen it, result in corrective action plans that require repayment of funds to HUD. And yes, that is correct for funds that they have not actually awarded you. So an example would be if you have a $100,000 grant and you have a $25,000 match requirement, if you have insufficient documentation of that $25,000 match, let's say you could only substantiate $5,000 of it, HUD could ask you to repay $20,000 of funds that they did not ask you, or that they did not grant to you. And so that's in the grant agreement. I have seen it happen. I hope I never see it happen again. The main thing is to get a documentation process and policy that works, and then through your internal monitoring, make sure that staff are actually carrying that out. Certainly some types of match documentation are easier than others. For example, if you have like a matching grant that pays for staff salaries, you could use potentially that matching grant to offset staff costs, and that would be a little bit easier to document than say food or like meals, which are also eligible. I do see a question in the chat. Do you have it? This is from Dr. Andrews. Do you have a cheat sheet on the various types of activities that are eligible for match? So Axton linked the virtual binder in the chat, but in essence, the activities that you can match is any activity that would be eligible under the grant agreement. So not necessarily awarded, but that would be eligible under the grant agreement. So for example, everyone's going to request some amount for admin. You could offset your admin costs with match. If they go above the 10%, you could, match supportive services. You could match rental assistance. You cannot match leasing because leasing doesn't have a match component. That's something that I feel like we should probably spend a little bit more time with. It wasn't really built into today's presentation, but in essence, while they're very serious about the documentation, what you actually match is a lot more ambiguous and kind of open for the project or the agency to determine what is the best fit for their participants and for the organization. That's all.
Great, thanks, Jim and Axton. So moving on, now that we've talked about HUD's monitoring strategies, I want to take the next couple of slides and talk through THN's monitoring strategies that we will be implementing in 2023 and beyond. We have recently updated and revamped our approach to ensure that we're aligning with the priorities that and direction that our HUD reps give us. So we'll be taking a much more intentional approach to monitoring folks this year and moving forward. We plan to use several methods to monitor both performance and compliance of CoC recipients, which include reviewing annual performance reports in SAGE as they're submitted. This is something that we already do pretty routinely. THN is not the approving body for your APR. That authority lies with HUD. But if we identify any concerns or red flags related to performance or compliance within the APR submission, we will definitely follow up with you and just likely ask some questions to better understand the report that was submitted. Additionally, we will monitor folks through quality review plans. So the folks who are subject to conditional inclusion in a given year will work with THN to develop a quality review plan to improve performance. Conditional inclusion essentially means that we recommended your project for funding to HUD through the annual CoC competition with the condition that you'll receive specialized technical assistance from THN staff for a minimum of 12 months for the purpose of performance improvement. All the folks who were conditionally included in FY22 or the most recent competition have already been notified. So if you have not been alerted to a quality review plan or conditional inclusion process, is not something you need to worry about this year, though is a real possibility for future years. Additionally, we plan to monitor folks through a renewed focus on the quarterly performance scorecards, which we'll be talking about later, as well as on-site and desk reviews, which we'll be talking about over the next couple of slides.
Hey, real quick, I know that we're talking about reviews. I just wanted to, I feel like I needed to say something about match. If you already have an approved match, like if you already have a match source and that's what you've told HUD, you have to do that. You cannot change your matching source without communication with your field office. So I just wanted to, I feel like I may have given folks the idea that like, oh, anything is eligible for match, and while things may be eligible to be used as match, the specific match source that you use must be communicated to your field office in advance of making changes to that match source, if that makes sense. So like every year you have to submit your match documentation to your field office if they request it. Some field offices do, some field offices may not, depending on the project. But if the, you'll submit something on agency letterhead or an MOU with a partner, if things change from that, that is okay, but you have to communicate that on the front end to your field office. And now I'll stop talking about that, but I feel like it was really important to say before folks got too far down the road with that.
Yeah, definitely important. Thanks for that note, Jim. So taking a closer look at on-site and remote desk reviews. So these are both strategies that we plan to implement in 2023. We anticipate that on-site reviews will be very similar to a HUD monitoring, and we plan on utilizing the same HUD monitoring exhibits to assess compliance that your HUD rep would use. So this would include a program file review, a financial review, as well as a review of documentation related to general administration and management. That being said, we as THN cannot issue a finding or corrective action plan in the same way that HUD would following monitoring, though if we have concerns as a result of a monitoring, we may request and strongly encourage you to participate in technical assistance with THN to ensure that compliance issues are resolved. I also want to note that selection for monitoring by THN does not exempt you from being selected for monitoring by HUD and vice versa. So it's possible that you could be monitored by both in a given year. Desk reviews will be completed remotely as needed using a complaint-driven process, meaning if a current or former participant submits a complaint to THN or the Balance of State CoC about their participation in the CoC program, that project will be subject to a remote desk review, which will be very similar to the on-site review, and will utilize the same HUD monitoring exhibits, though it will be less formal and will not include a financial review. The scope of that review will vary based on the nature of the complaint. But at minimum, you can expect that we'll review the client's file that submitted the complaint and any policies and procedures that were in place at the time the client received services. And those will be reviewed against the monitoring exhibits relevant to your project type. I see a question in the chat. Can we formally request from THN these on-site and remote desk reviews? That's a good question, and one that I don't think we've talked about internally. Jim, I don't know if you have any insight or thoughts.
Yeah, I will say that, we're very similar to everywhere else where capacity is a real issue. We, like Hope said, we have not discussed requested monitoring. So thanks for sticking yourself out there like that, John. Short answer is I don't have an answer. But right now we were not planning to honor requests for on-site reviews. I can tell you that for sure. We just simply don't have it in the budget to be able to go everywhere in a given year. So yeah, let me think about that one a little bit. We'll need to get back with you on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, John. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Axton to talk about some internal monitoring strategies for participants.
All right, so as we mentioned earlier when we were discussing the CoC project applicant expectation form, projects must have an internal monitoring strategy. So an important part of any internal monitoring strategy is going to be participant file reviews. So recipient agencies are encouraged to identify an internal review schedule with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So that means identifying who's responsible for completing the file review, who's responsible for ensuring that the review is completed, the schedule that those are going to be completed on, These are preferably all things that would be laid out in policy documents and not just done kind of haphazard, because it, to be effective, these have to be done on a regular basis. So what exactly does a participant file review look like? So it's basically a thorough analysis of all the files associated with a participant. We recommend that these are done quarterly, but should be done annually at a minimum. So, I mean, as Jim just mentioned, has been mentioned elsewhere, we know everyone has some capacity issues, so potentially reviewing all participant files every quarter is not feasible, but you should at least try to get them reviewed at least annually for PSH projects. And then we also recommend that participant files are reviewed within 2 weeks of a participant being enrolled and within 2 weeks of a participant exiting from the project. The requirements for rapid rehousing and joint transitional rapid rehousing projects, those are going to look pretty similar. Again, it entails a thorough analysis of all project files annually at a minimum. And then we also suggest reviewing about a quarter of your participant files on a quarterly basis, just to stay on top of that. And with potentially giving priority to older files. The longer a client has been in your system and been working with you, the more kind of records they're going to have associated with that. So there's more room for items to be missing or errors to be made. So again, we recommend prioritizing those older files. And then again, similar to the PSH, we recommend reviewing participant files within 2 weeks of enrollment and within 2 weeks of exit. The internal monitoring strategies for SSO projects will look a little bit different. Those projects should feel free to reference the HUD CPD monitoring exhibits that we referenced earlier, or also you're always free to reach out to us if you have questions about what kind of guidance you should be adhering to. Okay, so more detail on what participant file reviews look like. So the participant file review should focus on 6 main categories, and we'll just kind of go through them one by one. So you need to be checking for participant eligibility. So this could include documentation of homelessness is correct, potentially documentation of a disability. That's probably going to apply more to PSH projects. Similar, the documentation of chronic homelessness status is required, making sure that is done correctly and present in the file. Moving on, enrollment documentation. So you should be checking for that the enrollment paperwork has, for example, like the correct dates on it and the correct, all the signatures are signed. Making sure that a release has been signed for the client or participant to allow you to enter their information into HMIS or a comparable database if you use that. Moving on, also looking at rental assistance and leasing documentation. So that could include things like housing quality standard inspections, making sure those are completed on time and documented. That means completed before the client has moved in and before payments have been made. Making sure there's a copy of the lease in the client file. And again, kind of making sure there's dates align. You don't want to have a lease that starts on one date in a housing quality inspection that shows like a week later, because that needs to be done prior to. So just making sure all those dates are correct, dotting your I's, crossing your T's on those. Also need to be checking for service delivery documentation. So this would likely include like the initial needs assessment when the client is enrolled in a project. And it would also include any kind of annual assessments. Again, annual assessments could be needs assessments or financial assessments, and those generally need to be completed either 30 days prior to or within 30 days after the 1 year mark of the client's enrollment. So they are annual assessments, but we technically have a 60-day window to get those completed. Service delivery documentation could also include just like case notes and other documentations of the services rendered to the participant. You also need to be checking items related to just the HMIS database. So again, this would be making sure things like dates for like move-in or enrollments, making sure those dates entered in HMIS match any physical documentation. Again, HUD would not like to see an intake paperwork with one date completed and then enrollment in HMIS with like another date several weeks down the road. Dates need to be matched up when possible. Includes income and HMIS matches the income verification documents. So again, when you complete annual assessments or enrollment assessments and you're documenting income, making sure that your physical documentation verifying that income, making sure that matches with the information actually going into HMIS. And then finally, also looking at exit documentation. So this could include a copy of a participant's termination letter. If there is like an involuntary termination, we'd also want to see documentation that kind of all the appropriate steps were taken before that termination. So that means like multiple contacts attempts, making sure the client knows they have like a right to appeal that decision, and items like that. I think there are definitely more things that need to be checked for when doing a participant file review. These are just a few examples. And the THN, we have some internal monitoring guidance that I've just dropped into the chat that goes into a bit more detail of what those participant file reviews should look like.
Great, thanks, Axton. Before we move on, I just want to say if this is not something, not a practice that you are currently doing at your agency or within your program, I feel like the idea of starting it can be really overwhelming. So I feel like, if this is not something you're doing currently, a great next step would be, getting with your teammates and just finding some time on your calendar, blocking off a few hours to do a file review as a team. Go ahead and set up a recurring calendar invite for, every quarter or every month. So you have that time already blocked off, however frequently you decide to do it. Because it can be really it can be really hard to find time if you're also trying to operate a program and case manage folks. So go ahead and schedule that time in advance, and make it a fun team building activity. Again, we encourage all of this quarterly at minimum, but can be more frequent depending on the complexity of your project. So moving on, I want to talk through the process that you would use if through a file review, you identify a deficiency within a participant file. So this guidance comes straight from our internal monitoring guidance, which Axton just dropped in our chat, which states that when you identify a deficiency in a file, project staff should develop a memo to the file, which I believe we have a template memo if that's something you need. If that's the case, please reach out to us and we will share that with you. But the memo to the file should contain a clear plan that documents the steps you'll take to resolve the deficiency and when. And if after following those planned steps within that specified time frame, you're not able to resolve the deficiency, you should notify your HUD rep for further guidance. You are welcome and encouraged to reach out to us first so that we can help prepare you for that communication if that's something that you're interested in or something that you would benefit from. This, as I mentioned earlier, I see a couple folks asking for the template. Yeah, that's something that we can send out after this presentation, or if Axton or Jim have access to that and can share it quickly in the chat.
Yeah, I should be able to dig that up. It might take me a minute or two.
Great, thanks, Jim. So be on the lookout for that in the chat and you can download it. So this form is not intended to resolve serious deficiencies like potentially serving ineligible clients or using funds incorrectly. Again, back to my earlier point, it is always better to ask for forgiveness than try to hide an issue or a deficiency. And if you identify a serious deficiency that cannot be resolved and you don't alert your HUD rep and that deficiency is later identified in a HUD monitoring, you could potentially have to repay all of the funds spent on that participant. That's not meant to scare you, meant to prepare you. However, if you alert your HUD rep as soon as an issue or a deficiency is identified, there's a strong chance that they're going to be more, willing to be more flexible, and are likely going to be able to give you some direction on how to move forward and correct that issue. I see, a couple of folks asking for the PowerPoint. Yeah, we will share that after today's session to all the folks who attended, and that will link all of the resources that we've been talking about today, and we can include that memo to the file template as well. So folks will have all of the information that we covered today.
So whenever we're talking about this memo to the file, I know you've already said it, Hope, but I just want to reiterate, right? It's not intended it does not resolve an issue like where you've enrolled someone and they don't have sufficient support documentation for homelessness. But if, for example, a housing quality standards inspection was conducted outside the, outside the window, or the annual assessment was conducted on day 61 rather than day 59, right? That would be an appropriate place for a memo to the file. Or if, a service plan was conducted late. Again, it really, y'all, it's not intended to resolve more serious monitoring or internal monitoring issues of compliance. Again, we are available to support y'all through that. If, for example, I hope nobody finds himself in the situation, but if you discover through your internal process that, oh my gosh, we've been doing client eligibility wrong for the last 3 years, like that's what Hope and Axton live for at THN. Like we want to have that conversation with you because chances are it's probably not as bad as you're thinking. Or if it is as bad as you're thinking, we can tell you up front before you go to your field office that, hey, like this is what could happen, da, 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 da. Again, none of that is intended to scare anybody. Just, I've seen it over and over again where, forgiveness, asking for forgiveness is indeed the best approach to this thing. It looks like Axton dropped a memo to the file template in the chat. So if you have questions about how to use that form or when it's appropriate, or you're going to use it for something and you're not sure it's appropriate, please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And to reiterate that, we want to help, but we can't help if we don't know what's going on. So please reach out to us if you have a concern about your documentation, whether it's a participant file or, some administrative documentation. We can only help if we know what's going on. And we definitely don't want to find out at the same time as HUD. We want to prepare you as best as we can for that communication to HUD. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That is what we are here to do. So moving on to, we've talked about, program file reviews and client file reviews. Moving on to some more like financial and administrative items for review. This is not, let me go back. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but definitely a great starting point. So looking at these components, there are a number of areas where recipients can focus their attention when it comes to completing an internal review of these areas. And each of these items has a recommended time period by which you review those that you can note here, but these are recommended timeframes, but I would encourage you to do what's best for your unique project and your agency. So match documentation, we recommend reviewing this quarterly at minimum. Though depending on the type of match, it may be in your best interest to review this more frequently, as frequently as monthly. As Jim mentioned earlier, some folks, depending on your field office, are required to submit proof of match annually to your HUD rep at the time of your contract renewal or execution. This is also something that we collect annually through the CoC program competition, but we don't look at like the actual, source documentation that you maintain throughout the year, just those, commitments that occur annually. So if you use cash match, you should be maintaining documentation of expenditures paid for with cash match and any source documentation for those expenditures to ensure cost eligibility. If you use in-kind services for match, you need to not only maintain a clearly defined MOU or memorandum of understanding between your agency and the agencies providing services, but you also need to track and document the in-kind services provided to your participants within the given the grant year or operating year. I think Axon linked the match virtual binder earlier in this presentation. That's also linked later in the agenda. If you again, match documentation is the most common monitoring finding. So I would recommend spending some time with those virtual binders to make sure that you understand the documentation requirements of your match source. If you have questions about your documentation, you can send those to myself and Axton, and we are happy to provide guidance on your specific match source. Expenditures and cost allowability. We recommend reviewing this monthly, even if you only submit your draws quarterly, which quarterly is the minimum. This review should focus on ensuring cost allowability of expenditures before you draw those funds for reimbursement from LOCs, and also ensuring that your expenditures are accurate and complete and have source documentation where needed. Timesheets and activity tracking. If you are charging your staff time to multiple budget line items, which we expect that you would be, we would also expect that you have some method in place to track the activities of your CoC funded staff. The easiest way to do this that I've seen is incorporating that into your timesheet, so that your timesheets paint a really clear picture of exactly how your staff are spending their time to ensure that funds are being drawn correctly for reimbursement. For example, if you're charging a case manager's time to both the supportive services line and the rental assistance or leasing line, we would expect to see those time allocations on their timesheets. Single financial audit requirements. This doesn't apply to everyone, but it does apply to some folks. So specifically compliance with the single financial audit requirements. This is, something that we require folks to self-report annually during the competition. But with that said, we, at THN do our due diligence to verify those responses through the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. So would recommend, reviewing those requirements annually for compliance. SAM.gov registration and UEI or unique identity maintenance. These are things that we generally only think of annually, but things that we definitely want to make sure you take the time to review. You definitely do not want to find yourself in a scenario where either your SAM registration renewal or your UEI lapses for whatever reason, because those issues can take months to resolve. And we don't want to see you in a situation where you are no longer eligible to renew your project in the competition because there is, those renewals lapsed for whatever reason. If you are not the person responsible for maintaining this in your organization, I would encourage you to find out who that person is. And if you are the person responsible for this maintenance, I would strongly encourage you to make sure that someone else in your organization at least has access to those accounts. And there's a couple of other items on here I didn't go into detail on. that maybe aren't necessarily relevant to every project type, but if you have subrecipients, we recommend reviewing those subrecipients agreements annually. We are happy to review those as well if you want to send those to myself and Axton. Procurement policies, again, doesn't apply to everyone, but recommend reviewing those annually as well.
Just real quick on that procurement policy. For example, if you're subject to the single financial audit requirements, they're going to want to see the procurement process that you use to select your auditor, right? Like that's a real possibility, something that could come up in a monitoring. So you may think, oh, well, we don't really do procurement in the CoC program. And by and large, we really don't, right? But if your agency, again, is subject to the SFA requirements, they are going to want to see how you selected your auditor. And specifically, right, like how you're compliant with the audit or with the procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200. I just wanted to touch really quickly on the second bullet point, that expenditures and cost allowability review. What I've seen that look like most typically is a meeting between program staff and finance staff, right, where the finance staff will pull a report out of QuickBooks or whatever system y'all are using to track all of your expenditures. And then the two departments reconcile those reports together. I've seen it take, in my own experience, as little as 10 minutes. I've also seen it take hours, right? So you want to kind of budget your time accordingly, but this shouldn't be anything that's like too intimidating. I know we've got like the 2 CFR subpart E, all that stuff on there. Really what it is like the cost that you're billing to HUD or that you're seeking reimbursement for. One, were they allowable? Do you have the sufficient support documentation? And like, if it looks out of place to a program staff person, chances are, that's something that you want to review, right? Like you want to make sure that things are being billed to the grant are indeed allowable. Yeah, I feel like that one couldn't be overstated in terms of the importance of that as a regular activity. We do recommend doing that monthly. We do that monthly for each federal program that we administer at THN, which, again, can be burdensome, but also if you stack those meetings on top of one another, you can just set a half day for your department head to meet with your CFO or whatever the case may be. But yeah, that one is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I know we have been talking at you for quite a while and we've covered a lot of content. We just have a couple more slides to get through. If any questions are coming up for you, I know folks have been adding those in the chat. Feel free to continue doing that, but we'll have time here shortly for some Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Axton to talk about scorecards.
All right, quarterly performance scorecards, my current favorite topic. So as everyone here who operates a CoC project is likely aware, we have scorecards that are completed on a quarterly basis. And those scorecards are same metrics are also used during the annual competition. We are currently in the process of updating our quarterly scorecards. Kind of at the bottom there, we're hoping to get that done soon. And once our updated draft is finished, we will have some feedback sessions that people wanted to look over those changes and submit as feedback. But first of all, what is the scorecards? So the purpose of the scorecard is to just evaluate the effectiveness of projects. Some of the items that are looked at on the scorecard include elements from the annual performance reports, APRs. We also look at metrics pulled from the system performance measures, SPMs. We also check things like spending reports. And then there are a few items on the scorecard that are just self-report information we get directly from projects. There are 6, I guess, kind of basic categories that the scorecard cover. The first category is whether or not projects are targeting hard to serve individuals. So this is looking at things about like enrolling clients who don't have income or enrolling clients who are chronically homeless. We also are looking at access to income. This is a big part of the scorecard, both because we believe it's important, but also because of the way HUD weights things in the annual competition. Access to income metrics are very closely tied to the system performance measures, and HUD has a requirement that we weight kind of system performance measures requirements a certain amount when we are evaluating projects. So if you just look at the scorecard, it maybe seems like there's a lot of elements asking about income, but it is largely related to the priorities HUD wants to see. So that includes whether or not people are increasing income or maintaining their income depending on project types, and whether or not they have like income with their exiting projects, which is obviously going to be important for long-term stability. It tends to be hard for someone to maintain their housing if they're exiting the project with no income. So related to that, we also look at some housing stability metrics. That includes just like returns to homelessness, and just like the percentage of participants that are exiting to permanent housing destinations. We're also looking at a category we call meeting community need. So this includes things like a project's like average daily bed utilization. Ideally, projects are going to remain at or very close to capacity at all times, so they're serving as many people as possible. We also look at here, broadly stated as kind of access to mainstream benefits. So that can include accessing like Social Security benefits or healthcare benefits, and the role and the effectiveness with which projects are assisting participants with those. We also have a category that's looking at racial equity. This is maybe a newer category. I believe we've had it on the last scorecard, but it's kind of being modified and beefed up a little bit on this scorecard. I would say this is partially in response to kind of HUD's shifting priorities over the past few years, and like the CSC NOFOs that are put out. HUD has been kind of increasingly prioritizing efforts related to racial equity. I know these could be a newer concept for a lot of projects. So the metrics we are looking at for racial equity are not too stringent, and some of them are going to be likely be unscored elements, just to kind of let projects know kind of how they're performing on some of these without actually scoring them. That also includes whether or not the agency is working with people with lived experience, preferably in like decision-making positions in the organization. That could also include whether or not agencies have Black, Indigenous, and people of color in positions of leadership positions at organization or on a board. And then the kind of final broad category we look at on the scorecards is related to HMIS data quality. Again, this is another item that HUD tends to be pretty strict on, and a lot of the SPMs that we report to HUD are very much reliant on good data quality. So those are another important element of the scorecards that looks at kind of timeliness of data entry and missing data elements and just kind of missing assessments that are needed. So those are kind of 6 broad categories. As we mentioned, we are in the process of updating these scorecards. We hope to have the update completed soon, and then sometime around March, probably start soliciting feedback from you all and all the other CoC stakeholders. And yeah, have the opportunity to kind of further explain those scorecards or answer any questions you have about the metrics we are looking at or how those are being calculated. So I see there's a question in the chat here.
Yeah, I think that just speaks to the Michelle's comment speaks to the need for feedback from projects. So I know that we are planning to do a targeted feedback session with the current CoC recipients because I think that's not something that we've really done before, but wanting to, again, take that into account to the extent that it's possible. Michelle, right? Like there are a variety of different concerns, especially when you start getting into subpopulation specific programs that that maybe are not universal, but wanting to give folks the space to provide that type of feedback and see how we can incorporate that feedback into the CoC's tools. So that is something that we are planning to do, and hopeful that everyone on this call will join us for that when we're ready.
Yeah, and I would add, when we were working on updating the scorecard, I definitely had an eye for trying to make the categories we're looking at kind of as universal as possible, applying to as many project types as possible. But there are certain elements that will be evaluated differently based on project type. I know you brought up kind of special considerations for projects serving survivors of domestic violence. And there are kind of special carve outs in the scorecard that would kind of set different requirements in some of these metrics based on the project type and based on whether they're serving domestic violence survivors. All right, moving on. Just another list of resources for folks. So we have the THN's internal monitoring guidance. I believe that's already been posted in chat. We discussed that. We have a link in this presentation to the HUD CoC virtual binders. I think those were mentioned earlier in the chat as well. So that's a very good resource for just kind of getting more kind of top level kind of summary of some of this information. That you are not going to get everything you need to know about running a CoC project from the virtual binders, but they are a very good starting place and will kind of lead you to the more detailed resources and regulations that you do need to be aware of. And so I think those virtual binders are a very good place to kind of introduce yourself to some of these requirements. We also have linked the CoC program interim rules or interim rule. So that is, as I mentioned, like the virtual binders are kind of summarizing a lot of that information and trying to put it into a more digestible form. The CoC program interim rule is the big federal regulation that we all abide by through the CoC project. So that's the kind of final word on most of these things, but it's not always the easiest to comb through and comprehend. We are definitely available though if there are questions related to the interim rule. That's something we spend a lot of time looking at and hopefully could clarify if issues come up. We're also linking to the HUD monitoring and technical assistance training PowerPoint. So it's a training put together by HUD. We're also linking the CPD monitoring handbook. I believe that's already been linked in the chat and was referenced earlier on. So for the CoC program, that's mainly going to be chapter 29 and those monitoring exhibits that we already looked at. And then we also have a link to a couple newsletters here. So we would definitely encourage, if you have not already, to sign up for the THN's newsletters and particularly for the CoC competition newsletter. That's how we send out all our updates about the CoC funding competition and other CoC related matters. So it is very important to sign up for that newsletter so you can be informed when we're kind of having trainings like this or when there are competition updates. And then we would also encourage folks to sign up for HUD SNAPS newsletter. Again, very important information that comes out from HUD. If you sign up for those newsletters, you will probably end up getting more information that is necessarily relevant to your specific project. But given the importance of the kind of information HUD puts out, it's probably a good idea to sign up for those newsletters and kind of scan them when they come in, rather than just hoping you get that information some other way.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add to Axon's point, HUD does send quite a few emails through that SNAPS listserv, and they can be confusing as a recipient if you're not sure whether or not something applies to you. Feel free, as you're getting those emails, to forward them to myself or Axton, and we can tell you whether or not that is even relevant to your program or something you need to worry about. because there are some that, they'll announce deadlines through that listserv, but those deadlines are often for us as THN, as the collaborative applicant, and may not be relevant to you. So don't panic if you get emails, related to deadlines through the SNAPS listserv. Those deadlines are likely for us as the collaborative applicant and not for recipients necessarily. But again, if you have questions as you're receiving those emails, just pass them along to us.
All right, and finally, we have a list here of some other upcoming THN events, including training and engagement opportunities that we want to make you all aware of. So coming up shortly, we have the annual Homelessness Awareness Day, where THN and our CoC stakeholders will go up to the Capitol here in Austin and do some advocacy work, kind of lobbying some of the representatives up there, kind of speaking to the importance of funding of homelessness related items. I don't know this year if there are necessarily specific legislative items.
There are.
Okay.
Yeah, they're on the website. We can pull those down. And I just wanted to clarify, we're not lobbying, we're advocating.
Advocating.
Just to clarify that.
Probably an important legal distinction there.
There is an important legal distinction, yes.
After that, coming up at the end of next month, we have a general member orientation. So I believe these are trainings best suited for new CoC recipients to kind of get up to speed on kind of what the CoC is about and how to be involved in that and how the CoC can like serve you as a project. So that's going to be on March 28th. We also have coming up the second part of our authentic collaboration series. This one is going to be at the end of this month, into February. So we had the first part of that training, I believe, last week. Yeah, last Tuesday. And that was a very interesting training. I think it was very well attended, and I feel like the people attending were pretty involved in that training, and kind of the feedback we got afterwards was very positive. People seemed to feel like that was a very useful training. Authentic collaboration, I guess, to kind of clarify, that's speaking to how to work with folks who have lived experience and expertise of homelessness and how to work with them in your project to improve your project, including like putting those folks in positions at organizations, including hopefully positions that are helping to make decisions for the organization. I mean, it's great to have like peer support specialists who can help, but I think it's better to make sure you're kind of elevating those same folks to positions that are actually engaged in kind of program design and policy work as well. So again, authentic collaboration training part 2, so on February 28th. You can still sign up for that. Even if you didn't attend the first part, that first part I believe was recorded and should be made available soon, if not already.
Yeah, I think it's on the YouTube page. If it's not,
that's a good training for anybody to attend, regardless of whether you came to the first one. And then we also have our Advocacy 101 training coming up on March 9th. So again, that's kind of more information on how to engage with elected officials, not necessarily lobbying, but advocating with elected officials around issues related to homelessness and housing solutions. And yeah, again, so that training on March 9th. So you can see we have several kind of important trainings and events coming up, and we'd love to see you all take part in any and all of those. See, there's a request for the YouTube page. I think we can get a link for that.
Yeah, while you're finding that, Axton, I just wanted to say, if you did not attend part 1 of the authentic collaboration training, you really missed out. I would strongly encourage you to go back and watch that session on our YouTube channel and then register for part 2. I know it's a big time commitment, but it really is worth the time commitment. The speaker who delivered, or the speakers who delivered that training are incredibly impactful and engaging. I know there's, I feel like a couple folks in the room who attended part one. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the session, and if you wouldn't mind sharing those in the chat. If you're able to join us for part two, please register for that. Definitely don't want you to miss out on part two if you're able to attend.
Yeah, I just wanted to one more piggyback off of the part one, right? Part two will really focus more on the tangible hows of how to meaningfully engage persons with lived expertise without tokenizing, without minimizing or doing while minimizing the harm that your organization does to that person and other people. Right there, I think I'm not even going to try to approximate what the speaker would present because I don't feel like I do it very well. But I think that, like, you know, we have to embrace this as a means to end homelessness, right? Like, trying something new is really kind of you know, where we're at in terms of like creation and innovation around ending homelessness. So I think Ree is on Morris. She's a national technical assistance provider, has been working a lot with HUD specifically, literally co-authored or was at least acknowledged in the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness's the new federal strategic plan to end homelessness, right? Like, this is not an opportunity that we get regularly to engage with someone that's really making the decisions or helping to make the decisions about the national policy direction for the country. And so really encourage y'all to join and listen, and hopefully we can all try to incorporate some of what she is gonna share with us in terms of the how to actually do this work.
I just want to point out, Craig put it in the chat there, but if you were planning to participate in the Homeless Awareness Day on February 22nd, there is a preparation webinar being held tomorrow for folks who have already registered with that. For that, to kind of get an idea of what that will look like. And I don't know, Craig, if there's a separate link for that, or if
that link will be sent once you registered. You'll be sent that registration link automatically.
Okay, yeah. So we dropped the link above. I think I dropped it, and Craig also dropped it to register for Homeless Awareness Day. So you sign up for that, and then you will also, assuming you sign up today shortly, you will get the invite to the prep webinar that's being held tomorrow for that.
Correct.
And I think that takes us through all of our planned content for today. We do have some time left for Q&A. So if you have any questions, we can definitely do this now. And you can use the chat or, you know, unmute yourself.
So John's got a question in the chat. The subrecipient agreements you noted on the previous slide for internal monitoring, would that include subrecipient/clients signed agreements on project eligibility policies and procedures? So John, I think to clarify, the subrecipient agreements are for organizations who are the direct recipient of CoC program funds, but then sub-award out some portion of their award to another organization to carry out the activities. So a really good example of when this occurs is like if a city government applies for CoC program funds, like let's say a community development department would apply for CoC program funds and they got it. Chances are that community development department is not going to have the staff necessary to actually administer the project. So they will often contract with an eligible nonprofit to actually carry out the activities. They may do some portion of that. Typically they will have to do like the administrative portion, like making the draws from e-locks, doing the APRs, all that sort of thing. They may retain some other kind of like rental assistance focused activities and funds to do those activities. But more often than not, they like subcontract those all out to another nonprofit. But that's not exclusive to city governments, right? Like an eligible nonprofit that's awarded CoC program funds could subcontract those funds out, provided that it was disclosed in the application. Like you can't just decide to sub-award out your funds during the middle of your grant term. it has to be part of the project design. So the short answer to your question is those subrecipient agreements have their own kind of conditions that need to be in them. So that's kind of the subrecipient agreements that we're talking about, right? Like it's very similar to an MOU, but it's more structured because you're actually passing funds between the organization and federal funds at that. So like we highly recommend that recipients that have subrecipients, one, you're already required to monitor those subrecipients. So that's something that should be happening. And if it's not, we can talk more about that. But like your subrecipient agreement, for example, if you let that lapse, you're out of compliance with HUD. So and then if HUD were to come monitor you and your subrecipient agreement was, 6 months stale, meaning it had expired 6 months ago, then that could be a finding, right? So we encourage folks to monitor that on a regular basis and update them. And to the extent that it's possible, make them as much as a living document as you can, with the understanding that it's for all intents and purposes a contract between the organizations. Like those agreements and those relationships evolve over time, and the subrecipient agreement should reflect the current relationship as it is today. So now what you're talking about now, client signed agreements, those sorts of things, project eligibility documentation, all that stuff would fall under the participant review, right? Like all of that stuff should be maintained in your client files, whether that's, their signature on the homeless eligibility form or their signature on the, their rent contribution calculation, or their acknowledgement that they received the termination and grievance policies, like a copy of those policies when they enrolled in the project. All that sort of thing should be is somewhat distinct and would be conducted in the participant file review. Yeah, it's a good question though. Now, the other distinction there is, so there is a distinction between a subrecipient and a vendor or a contractor. If you think that you're in a situation where you're hearing this and you're like, oh no, or do we have subrecipients, or do we have contractors, or what do we have? Like, feel free to reach out. There's some guidance from HUD that will help kind of clarify that. But essentially, the main distinction is that a subrecipient has kind of the autonomy that they need to make programmatic decisions, right? So like if you subcontract out some portion of your funds to an organization that is making eligibility determinations, like that is a subrecipient, right? But if you're contracting with an organization to help you do one-time moving assistance, right? Like folks are moving into housing, that would be like a vendor type of relationship and not something that would require a subrecipient agreement. So Rebecca's asking, when participants exit back to homelessness by their own choice, what is the impact of that on the grant, as it is not a positive housing outcome? So yeah, in general, exits to temporary destinations and some institutional destinations like jails would impact your project's performance, right? I think what we should be working towards, and I'd let Axon and Hope chime in here wherever they feel appropriate, but is a world where participants are supported to maintain housing stability, and that is the end goal of the project, right? So anytime the project or participants' time in the project nets in something other than housing stability, that's going to be that's not great, right? It's also not realistic for 100% of the people to go to housing stability 100% of the time, right? Sometimes we know that it's going to take several iterations of housing opportunities before someone kind of gets to a place of housing stability. And unfortunately, there are folks that will not find housing stability in their lifetime, right? Like that's an unfortunate reality. I think that is something that we should be working towards a world where we minimize or eliminate that as a possibility for someone. But there are people that, like, regardless of the number of times that your project, and Rebecca, I can't remember exactly where you're from, but I think it's Denton, where your project offers them 6 opportunities and every single one of them ends in an eviction or a threatened eviction, right? Like that's real, that happens. So as a project, I think working towards again, like, is it in the realm of possibility to rehouse that person, right? If it's in the realm of possibility that you're going to be able to rehouse that person, meaning they've verbalized some desire to go into permanent housing or some desire to continue to work with the project, like if they lose a housing placement, that by itself doesn't necessarily have a negative impact unless it's also followed by a program termination, right? So you have to kind of think about those two things separately, right? Like there's the rental assistance portion of the project, or the amount that y'all spend on rental assistance, and then there's their project participation, right? They're not synonymous. So you could have someone in your project that, you know, was in housing and then for whatever reason lost that housing placement and is working with the case manager to identify another housing placement. That situation would not impact your project in the same way that someone was in housing, they lost their housing, and then they just didn't make any contact with the case manager, and you haven't heard from them in 6 months, and now you have to do an exit, and you don't know where they went, right? Like that's the worst case scenario. So it's kind of on a continuum, right? Like there's a lot of nuance there, but in general, when folks in their relationship with the project and a situation that is other than permanent housing, that's going to impact the performance of the project.
Yeah, I would just add that those two metrics, the exits to permanent housing destinations and returns to homelessness, those are both SPMs. So those are elements that are very important when the CoC is competing for funds, which is why that we kind of prioritize them on our scorecards. But also those elements are obviously not like just like yes or no questions. So if there's just like one or two clients that happens to, that's not going to necessarily like tank a project score. Especially if the project is serving a lot of folks. We're usually looking at percentages for those. So like a single weird exit like that, where someone that chooses to just leave the project and exit to homelessness, is not necessarily going to doom the project or anything on their scoring, but it will be counted.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is just reiterating that, you know, exits to negative housing destinations kind of come with the program, right? So they aren't necessarily in every case, you know, a negative reflection on the project. But if it's something that is happening, you know, routinely or often, you know, there may be a deeper conversation that we can have with you as THN and see what support that we can provide to you. When it comes to like reporting that information in your annual performance report to your HUD rep in Sage, there is an opportunity to provide, you know, a narrative on your outcomes. So if you had, you know, more negative exits than you would have hoped, you can speak to that in your performance report, and HUD will have that information available to them when they're reviewing your report. Yeah, Michelle, I see your comment that exit has more to do with some substance use issues. Yeah, I hear you. Again, like to an extent, those exits can be, you know, anticipated, definitely not frequently, and again, aren't always a, you know, reflection on the project, but potentially could be in certain situations. So if you'd like to have, you know, a deeper conversation on what that looks like for your project, we can definitely do that. And that offer goes to anyone.
Yeah, and I would think if it's a participant who has maybe just like left their unit, you lost contact with them, I believe that would probably eventually result in like an involuntary termination, which you would likely want to be speaking to THN about that anyways, to kind of talk through that before any termination occurs.
Client engagements are also huge factors for negative exits. Can you say a little bit more about that? Eden, or are you asking, is that a question? Yeah, so I think it's it kind of depends, right? So it depends, one, on the type of project. It depends, two, on where they're at in their housing journey. So one thing that cannot or should not be a factor in a negative exit would be clients' engagement or participation in like case management, holistic case management. I want to be really clear that when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about putting people in housing and then not checking on them or not, providing them the adequate supports that they need, right? Like there is an expectation. And if you go back and like read the Housing First manual that the guy who invented the intervention developed, right? Like some engagement is non-negotiable, right? Like you have to be able to verify that they're still living in the unit. You have to be able to verify that they're paying their portion of the rent. You have to, there's some things that are kind of non-negotiable, but there are other things that are a little bit more, or that are entirely client driven, right? Like whether or not they engage with their case manager in whatever life skills course, right? That in and of itself would not be, like, let's say that's the scenario, right? Like you have a client that you're working with and they said that they wanted to do life skills courses and have, not done them after 6 to 9 months. That reason in and of itself would not be a reason to exit them from the program, right? Now, if there were negative behaviors associated with, or negative consequences associated with that, whatever behavior, right? Like let's say they're not engaging with their, case manager or life skills, but they're also getting lease violations. They're also getting, law enforcement interactions. They have pending criminal charges or whatever the case may be. The natural consequences of them not engaging potentially could influence a negative exit. But again, the non-engagement by itself in that respect would not be a reason for a negative exit. Now, the thing the follow-up question there is like, well, what do we do whenever they get terminated, right? Should we rehouse them? And I think that's the opportunity to have that conversation with this person about, hey, what happened in the last place? Do you want to be rehoused? If you do want to be rehoused, great. What's going to be different about the next place, right? And I know that we have some real experts on service delivery in this room right now that can probably speak to it much more eloquently than I can these days. I feel like I've gotten a little stale on how those conversations look, in real time. But the idea is that, again, we're working towards an end result where everyone that you engage with in this project has a stable housing placement when they're exited from the project. So I don't know if that really answered your question. I think the other one, though, about like, if you don't know if someone's actually living in their apartment or not, that's a different question, right? Like it's a different conversation, because you cannot continue to use federal funds for units that you don't know are occupied by the participant that are supposed to be in there. So that's another conversation that we can have if you feel like that's the scenario. But I'm not sure if I even answered your question, Eden.
And I think the only thing that I would add, and Jim, you may have said it, but if your case managers aren't actively reaching out to participants, it is likely that that could result in a negative exit, not because you're penalizing them for not engaging, but simply because you don't know what's going on with your participant. You don't know how to support them. Could potentially be engaging in some risky behavior. Again, those aren't reasons for termination, but if you're not engaging with clients frequently, it is hard to support them in their housing stability journey. We have a couple more minutes left if there are any additional questions.
And we recognize that this may not, again, this training did change from the original intended training for this time. So if you came into this with specific questions that have not been answered, like, please dump them in the chat. If we can't answer them today, we'll get you answers to them. Do you have any idea on when CoC awards will be out? I wish. No. So, unfortunately, this supplemental NOFO those awards did come out. The result was disappointing in some ways, but really encouraging in some other ways. Specifically, the project that did get funded in the balance of state is going to bring access to Texans that have never before had access. So that's an amazing thing, and by itself. But the other side of that coin is there are a lot of really disappointed communities that worked really, really hard on that part of the competition. So HUD has said that there's going to be another round. I'm not holding my breath on the other round that they're promising. By my calculations or our calculations, there's about $7 million that still needs to be allocated nationally. So, even if all 7 million of that went to the balance of state, there's still going to be a lot of really upset people for the supplemental NOFO. The annual NOFO we have not heard about yet. We will know when if you're signed up for those competition listservs. That's the first place that it will be announced, unless someone leaks it from HUD, which has happened in the past. But yeah, we're expecting that imminently, as far as the annual competition announcements go, and hoping for a better result in that one. But yeah, if you have other administration questions that didn't get answered in this space, again, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can also email Hope Axton or I to try to get some answers for you. I know that these programs are exceedingly complicated and can feel overwhelmingly complex sometimes. So we are here to support y'all, right? I know we spent a lot of time talking about monitoring strategy and risk assessments and all that stuff, which is important. But our goal with all of that is to support y'all, right? Like we said in this slide, we do not have the ability to issue a finding or even put you on a corrective action plan if we identify something and that's that's out of compliance with your project. Our goal at that point is to work with you to fix it, right? So we are your support and your advocate in this process. To HUD, internally, externally, we want everyone to succeed. So, yeah, I thank y'all for joining us for this this session. Hope, I'm sure you have some closing remarks. I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, no, unless there's any other questions, thanks so much for attending today. Again, this is part one of a multiple part series, so be on the lookout for some additional information coming to your inbox about part two and beyond. As mentioned previously, we'll be sending out some information shortly about our quarterly performance scorecard feedback session. And we will, in that announcement, also send out, or shortly after, send out drafts of the proposed scorecards. So would encourage you to review those in advance and even test those scorecards using some current data. So you can come prepared to that session to give us your feedback, because we do want your feedback to shape that process and want it to be as collaborative as possible in 2023 and beyond. And other than that, again, thank you for attending. And we will send out all of the materials, recording, and any supplemental documentation that we covered by email at some point. Probably today or later this week, but as soon as we can. And with that, we'll give you 5 minutes back in your day. I hope y'all have a great rest of your week. Happy Valentine's Day, and we'll see y'all soon.
Thanks, everyone.